Welcome from me, Guy Monson, to our regular 6-minute strategy. As we inch towards US Election Day on November 5th, Vice President Harris and former President Donald Trump are finally fleshing out their economic policies. Harris would broadly advocate for a higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy, increased government involvement in healthcare, and investment in clean energy and infrastructure. All of this as part of a more regulatory and climate-conscious approach to the US economy. By contrast, Donald Trump will continue his low-tax, protectionist and deregulatory policies, focusing on boosting domestic industries, especially fossil fuels. Extensive tariffs can be expected, particularly aggressively in their approach to China. In the slides that follow, my colleague Dr. Subitha Subramaniam and I will look at what this means for markets and for your portfolios 45 days from now as the US goes to the polls. Welcome, Subitha. It's lovely to have you back on 6-Minute Strategy. I mean, a run-up to a really defining moment for politics, economics and markets, everything really, in this US election on November 5th. Where do we stand today?
So I think we have two candidates who have vastly different views on the role of the government in the economy, the role of tariffs, taxes, yes, climate, deregulation, and how the US will interact with its allies and adversaries. So very different visions.
What do the polls tell us, and what's the risk of a clean sweep for either party?
So today the polls have Harris leading by about just over 2.5%, but I think it's still too close to call, and it's a toss-up because the US operates a first-past-the-post election system, which really means that the Democratic candidate needs to have just over 3% lead in national polls to really win the electoral colleges. So I think it's very much to anyone's to win today.
And the risk of a clean sweep on either side, taking the House and the Senate?
So the way the Senate races are looking, it appears that the Republicans are likely to keep the Senate. And if they lose the presidency and Harris wins, then she will most likely get the House of Representatives as well. So it'll be a divided government under President Harris. And if it's under President Trump, it's more likely to be a clean sweep.
Gosh, there's some risk there. So let's look at the pros in a bit more detail. Let's begin with Trump fans. Deregulation, tax cuts. Tell us what the details are here.
So the overarching theme under Trump and Vance are tax cuts. So they would like to make permanent the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. Yes. They'd also like to reduce the corporate tax rate further to 15%, which would make the US incredibly competitive on a global scale. They'd like to eliminate taxes on Social Security. And they'd like to pay for all of this using tariffs on China and all their trading partners. So that's really the big risk.
And the market's going to be quite sceptical on what they can raise in hard money from tariffs.
Yes. And the other sort of thrust of the policy really is deregulation, yes, particularly aimed at the energy sector. So they'd like to increase the US's role in global energy markets. Compare this to an interventionist, a supportive and for lower incomes agenda of Harris and Walz. So the Harris-Walz proposals really look at making those that are less well off better. So it's increasing the government's social safety net. A key tenet of their policy is to increase the child tax credit for families. They also have a plan to support down payments for those who are buying homes for the first time. And they plan to pay for all of this by raising the corporate tax rate to 28%. So that would make that would take the US to the upper end globally and less competitive. So less aggressively expanding the deficit, but again, no real nod to fiscal conservatism. Yes. So you've done some interesting numbers on the next slide showing the social impact in terms of where those tax cuts and tax raises go. Just explain what this chart shows. So this is a model that's run by the University of Pennsylvania's budget model, and they look at each quintile of the income, and they basically try to model whether they'll be better off or worse off under Trump or Harris. And you can see clearly from this table that the bottom 3 quintiles are better off under Harris. And this is really coming through from a lot of the income support they receive. And the top 2 quintiles of household incomes are better off under Trump. And this comes through from the tax cuts that he's really proposing to make permanent. So a very different societal vision from both teams, gosh. Let's drill down on this in terms of the economic implications, which we've been working on at Saracen. Then I'll make some comments on what it could imply for asset allocation of markets. Let's look at Trump first. So the first key issue with Trump is inflation. If he does come through with the tariffs on China and all other trading partners, I think this is likely to result in higher prices for US consumers. The second issue with Trump is deficits. They're likely to increase by roughly a percentage point every single year. So roughly almost 10% over a 10-year horizon. And in terms of growth, I think there are positives from the deregulation and the tax cutting agenda, and there are negatives from the rising inflation and the deficits. So it's really not much.
In terms of how we think equity markets will respond, in equity terms, we think US will definitely do better than global. It'll really be huddling closer to that US corporate model. Fixed income, US treasuries are likely both to sell off due to higher inflation. The yield curve could steepen, again, skepticism over the management of the debt long term. Gold and probably crypto will be supported as longer-term inflation hedges. And in the US dollar, in the short term, I think tariffs and inflation are probably supportive of the dollar. But in the long term, that debt sustainability is going to weigh on sentiment. Let's do the same for Harris. What are the key economic implications?
So in terms of growth, I think the key challenge with Harris is that raising the corporate tax rate is not really that great for economic growth. In terms of inflation, I think we expect broadly a neutral effect. And in terms of the deficit, she's more prudent. Her policies try to pay for some of the government support. So there's some pickup in deficits, but not to the extent of Trump.
And for global markets, that probably means the US underperforming global markets, a rally particularly in Asia and China. Fixed income, no material change. Yes, the deficit is moderately higher, but it won't lead to a sharp sell-off in US treasuries, and probably likely long-term weakness in the US dollar, so more an international markets beneficiary. Well, I hope that gives you a first shot at what these two candidates promise in economic terms and what we might see in terms of markets. Subitha, we're going to need you back in 45 days' time when that great vote comes to pass, and we'll be back to tell you what we think it means for markets and for your portfolios in a month or two from now. Thank you.